Ludwig Klages' essay, Carl Gustav Carus as Romantic Thinker, 1930. Ever since the author of these lines rediscovered the psychologist Carl Gustav Carus and was able to demonstrate the profound relevance of his teachings for contemporary science, one does hear his name mentioned from time to time. But one must also ask, is anyone actually reading his works? It does seem, in fact, that, in spite of the fact that many students now recognise his name, the true significance of his teaching goes unrecognised. Thus, before we can comprehend the intellectual situation in which Carus developed, we might mention some of the established facts in the story of his creative life. Precisely 4 decades after the birth of Goethe, Carus was born in 1779 in Leipzig. His father was a master dyer, and his mother was the descendant of a long line of brilliant natural scientists and medical men. His earliest conscious thought, he tells us in his Denkwürdigkeiten memoirs, occurred during the 5th year of his life, and his recollection is so characteristic of the man that we now repeat it. In leafing through the pages of the old Orbis Pictus of Amos Comenius, the boy stumbled upon an illustration bearing the inscription, "The Human Soul." There I saw the drawing of a table upon which stood a triangle adorned with the eye of God and sketch of a human figure. This chance event immediately caused him to turn his gaze to his inner world, and in a moment he was seized by the cryptic formula. Even you possess a soul. Even you are a soul. And for many days he was unable to get these words out of his mind. In fact, they were to haunt him down to the very day of his death. In 1804 he attended the Hochschule in Leipzig, that would be high school, beginning his studies with botany, all the while sketching every plant species that he found in the district. Finally, he devoted himself passionately to anatomical studies, winning his doctorate in 1811 with An Attempt at a General Theory of Life. In 1814, he became a full professor and director of the maternity hospital in Dresden. He established gynecology as a discrete discipline, worked on comparative anatomy, he provided his own illustrations for his published work in this field, and somehow managed to find sufficient time away from his medical practice to create brilliant oil paintings depicting the seasons, landscapes, and architectural monuments in which he took so much delight. During this same period, he became friendly with Caspar David Friedrich. In 1818, he inaugurated his correspondence with Goethe, whom he was to visit in Weimar on July 21st, 1821. He travelled widely, visiting such places as Rügen, Prague, Switzerland, and Genoa. His studies, which were incredibly comprehensive in their scope, dealt not only with the biology of living organisms, but extended well into such fields as geology, paleontology, cranioscopy, physiognomics, quote, vital magnetism, landscape painting, epistemology, metaphysics, and research into the history of literature. His final tally of published works soars to 81, but that number does not tell the whole story of his productivity, for most of his works appeared in multi-volume sets. In 1827, Carus was appointed to the prestigious position of personal physician to the King of Saxony, and he was to remain at his post until his death in 1869. There can be no doubt that Carus was one of the greatest scientists to emerge from the period to which historians have given the unfortunate name of, quote, late Romantic. The so-called late Romantics were in fact the consummate Romantics, for the early Romantics did not fully deserve the name. Even now the name Romantic has led to numerous misunderstandings, which suggest comparisons with the pseudo-distinctions that have been alleged to exist between a, quote, Roman and a, quote, foreign spiritual tendency. Likewise, one must occasionally endure the parsonic prattle of the enemies of the Romantics, who insist that the Romantic movement was merely a stopover on the reactionary high road to the full-fledged revival of Catholicism ignoring the fact that the charge holds true only for a mere handful of the movement's adherents. The heart of the matter is that the Romantics' greatest achievement was in developing a completely unprecedented vision of the world of actuality. Likewise, the Romantics represented a completely Germanic mode of contemplation. No non-German land can seriously entertain the claim of precedence for one of their own candidates, for no non-German writer ever approached the lofty achievements of the great German Romantics. The German Romantics formed a unified front against the mindless cult of reason that so agitated 18th century Europe, in large part because, unlike their rivals, the Romantics were never animated by the obsessive classicism of the Hellenic revival, preferring instead to examine their own German past. And in this process the Romantics rediscovered, and reaffirmed, the greatness of the Gothic Middle Ages, just as they opened up to a whole new field of study in their research into the cultural genius of the prehistoric Germanic world. And the Romantics were not merely a band of wandering poets and dreamers, for they also created romantic music, and a romantic style in painting, a uniquely romantic style of historiography, a romantic ethnology, even a romantic doctrine of political economy. Transcending all of these achievements was their creation of an idiosyncratically romantic school of natural science. In every one of the fields that we have mentioned, the German Romantics became the truly significant pathfinders. Names like Niebuhr, Schlosser, Raumer, Ranke, Arndt, Jacob, and Wilhelm Grimm are just a few among the countless creators of that imperishable intellectual revolution known as Romanticism. And they have provided us with a rich legacy that even now is making brilliant contributions to cultural history. And the same holds true in the scientific fields. The very first formulation of the cellular theory, in fact, was the work of Lorenz Oken. The theory of evolutionary development, which arranges all organic life into a series of transformations, has its source in the speculations of the Romantic nature philosophers. Cuvier, Goethe, Geoffrey, Treviranus were the forerunners. Von Baer, and above all, Carus, were the most powerful preservers and extenders of this tradition of evolutionary theory, which has of course ruled the scientific universe ever since. Finally, let us dismiss the blatantly mendacious fable convenue whispered by those fools and faddists who insinuate that the Romanticists never made a genuine discovery that was not preordained by the very partisan oracle, namely their wish fantasies. The Romantics justly preferred to regard them as inner convictions. The Romantics knew full well that they had involved themselves in a bitter war of the spirit that was already raging ceaselessly and savagely between the vital world of the Romantics and the dictatorship of the Enlightenment saviours, who preached the perpended world as machine philosophy that these shamans of the mechanistic apocalypse insisted would be man's salvation. Sadly, the mechanistic apostles had already triumphed in one campaign after another from the middle of the previous century and down into the age of Carus. It was only fair to recognise that the mechanistic movement's publicists and prophets were themselves probably unaware of the sinister fact that their banal theories were being remorselessly exploited in order to enrich and empower one particular social class. Specifically, the cash-crazed technocrats who were mounting the Industrial Revolution, even as the Romantics waged their quixotic war against the machine worship that was soon to enslave even the machine's victims. Admittedly, the Romantics had their own limitations, one of the few things that they possessed in common with the rest of mankind. They were also bogged down in the Platonic worship of ideas, a crippling error that they compounded by incorporating the equally disastrous notion, probably influenced by Goethe's adoption of the same idea, that behind the unconscious processes that transpire within the living world, there exists a type of, quote, world reason that keeps everything in line. Well, nevertheless, their errors have perished for the most part, or at least the influence that their false doctrines once exerted have been diminished appreciably. And nothing can ever change the fact that it is to the German Romantics that we owe the imperishable treasures that they discovered within their own visionary hearts. When we ask ourselves, what was the source of the unique vision of the Romantics? The clear and unambiguous answer resounds. The Romantic thinkers sought to follow Goethe's example by focusing their attention less upon the causes that brought about the phenomena before them, and more upon the meaning. However, they also recognised, and in this area in fact they went far beyond the scope of Goethe's research, that the universe can only be comprehended as a realm in which phenomenal essences, souls, appear. As a result, their natural science entailed an attendant psychology, just as their psychology entailed a comprehensive system of natural science. No Romantic had a clearer perception than Carus of the way in which science and art led to a unified existence at the deepest level of life, and this insistence upon the innermost indivisibility of science and art became a slogan that he employed on numerous occasions as a true description of his intellectual mission. Just as Carus sought to indicate the visible signatures that identify specific forms of planetary life in his landscape and painting, so did he employ the methods of natural science in order to inscribe the nature of that planetary life to the appropriate scientific formulae. The richest fruit to emerge from these meditations was his treatise, Psyche, on the developmental history of the soul. The first edition of this treatise, which he has begun to work on during 1843, was brought out by the publisher Michaelis in 1846. The second edition appeared in 1851. Diederik's has recently brought out a reprint of the second edition. Carus was well aware of the outstanding value of his work, which in later years he would always describe as the closest to his heart of all of his published treatises. Let us now present a brief sketch of at least the main points proclaimed in this treatise. If it is true that the soul is identical with what the ancients called the, quote, principle of life, an idea, of course, that has been forgotten since the age of Descartes, then it must be the case that the soul cannot be divided into component parts any more than it can have received its nature from the addition of discrete components that can be assembled to form a whole. Since Descartes, however, a completely erroneous doctrine has infected the science of psychology due to the reigning superstition that psychology can only achieve results by basing itself upon a program of mathematical quantification. And this is something that has long been the established praxis among researchers of the mechanistic persuasion, a school that prospers today beyond its dreams. Carus holds that just as the organism is formed from the fertilized cell from which developmental phase it begins to differentiate itself, thus every transformation of the soul is a process of development. And as such, it has no conceivable resemblance to the mere collection of measurable points, or to the process whereby a factory worker assembles a machine out of its discrete components. If the soul is the principle of life, then we are justified in concluding that it cannot also be synonymous with consciousness. Every cell that makes up our body lives, but its life and experience is as devoid of the faculty of consciousness as a houseplant. When we observe life in its antithetic relationship to consciousness, we discover something that Goethe was the first to comprehend, and to which he gave the name unconscious, which is the reason why Carus explicitly states on the very first page of Psyche that, quote, the key to an understanding of conscious thought resides in the realm of the unconscious, unquote. Any thinker who sought to exhaust the implications of that proposition would soon discover that a human lifetime is not sufficient to permit him to achieve his goal. Well, we will restrict ourselves here to drawing your attention to just 3 points. Since the age of Descartes, philosophers have directed their attention to the nature of moods, feelings, rages, and so on. And yet, after all the time they have devoted to these matters, they find themselves precisely where the founders of the rationalist school of thought began. Thus, feelings are perturbationes animi, or, to put it more cautiously, they are dark, chaotic thoughts. One may recall in this connection the elevation of feelings that occurs when we witness a sunset, or when we listen to a Beethoven symphony. Nevertheless, there are defective doctrines at work here, all of which must be overturned before we can arrive at a purely philosophical analysis of these discoveries. It is at this precise point that one may first be struck by the intuitive conviction that the cult of reason and the cult of nihilism are as thick as thieves with each other. However, since the age of Carus, we are able to understand that feelings, and this holds true of every conceivable species, merge their substance with consciousness from moment to moment under the governance of the overall condition of the body, which in turn experiences transformations under the influence of the impressions that fall upon the senses. The inherently unconscious processes of life exert their influence upon consciousness, and the resultant effects we call feelings. And this fact satisfactorily accounts for the obvious ability of an access to joy to improve the condition of the organism, just as an increase of sorrow or melancholy limits and diminishes the organism. Why, for instance, do intoxicating beverages produce their familiar effects? Carus understands why, and explains that the chemical processes involved link the living organism to the condition of the soul that results from the consumption of alcohol. Therefore, there does indeed exist a spirit of wine. Further, all living processes occur rhythmically. One recalls the pulses, the respiration, the alternation between sleep and waking. In addition, we must understand that every consciousness necessarily sinks periodically into the unconscious, and it is at those times that the healing processes transpire. There can never be an identical repeat of the so-called representation. It is much more accurate to say that a representation will either fade and disappear, or it will elevate itself and thereby acquire a nimbus. One may recall the joyous blossoming of one's youth, which remains in memory long after childhood has ended. Our consciousness beats the colours of our own nature, and our character reaches into the most sublime meditations. Finally, the loss of awareness that accompanies a profound and dreamless sleep is not to be interpreted as a decrease in life, for in the most acute sense it represents a growth and an improvement in the vital powers. Meanwhile, the limits that divide the conscious life from the unconscious may collapse, resulting in the possibility that those limits which separate the organism from the life of the world will also disappear. It was in the pondering of thoughts such as these that the Romantics were led to investigate the phenomena of somnambulism, dreams, clairvoyance, presentiment, and also to discover whether or not an infection of the soul could be alleviated by the application of the healing powers of magic. Still, Carus could not have been the grand Apollo of the spirit that he always remained if he did not carefully protect his mind from the influence of certain incautious exaggerations to which such meditations might lead. Nevertheless, even in his most platonic moments, Carl Gustav von Carus stands out as one of the greatest, as well as one of the last, of the authentic Romantic thinkers.